Okay, we're back. So I just took a couple of minutes and implemented some more stuff around the last part of the sentence that needs to get printed out in the toString around the genders. I basically added a couple of methods here. One is called get gender pronoun to student. This is interesting that it can't be private because I want to reference it in the test. So what I do is I make it package protected. It doesn't have a visibility qualifier there, and I annotate it with is visible for testing. So this is a simple switch statement on gender, which is a field that I added that stores the gender from the constructor. I didn't. I just skipped for the sake of brevity. I skipped the validation of the gender, which is something that that I should do and would write unit tests for. But I want to move on to more important things, or at least demonstrate to you guys more interesting things. So I made that and added some unit tests for that, and then I also modified toString to then append, well, two spaces after the period, and then say gender pronoun. So he or she says, and then what everybody says, which is this class is too much work. And so, as a result, I've now got a bunch of tests that pass, even this one, so let's just watch it pass. Oh, and by the way, I added an extra space there so that everything passes, so no good. I will stop ignoring this one because now it is a test that should pass. Let's run all of them. And all 16 tests pass. Yay! Okay, so now I've basically got almost everything except for gender validation working here in the student class. So I'm going to commit all this stuff up and then move on to integration testing, which is like way more interesting. So added enough implementation so that the toString method does what I expect. Oops. Push. Okay, so now integration testing. So we learned about unit testing last week, and the whole idea is that unit testing exercises the functionality of a unit within your code, like a class or a method in that class. These are meant to be very targeted tests with a very small blast radius, right? You're really looking at the smallest program elements you can. It's hard to get much smaller than a method. But that's not all of your code. That only focuses on, like, here again, one class or maybe a couple of classes. You also want to be able to validate the functionality, the larger functionality of your classes. So yes, you want to make sure that all of the pieces of your program work nicely independently, but also when they depend on each other, when they interact with each other, you want to evaluate that and you want to make sure that they work well together. And this is what integration tests do. So integration tests test larger chunks of your application, and often often require how should I say, more dependencies. So maybe it's multiple classes, but also it might be something like, oh, you've got a web service, or you've got a database in there, or you're writing to the file system. They're just bigger in scope. It's not just Java code. It's probably your code and something else. But this is still important to have automated tests for these things, right? Because even if all of your classes work just fine in isolation, all your objects are happy in isolation, if they don't interact with each other well, your application's still going to fall over. So I have an example of an integration test called Student IT, and notice that these tests, if you go and look at them in the project, they're often a different place. They are in the IT directory, where the unit tests are just in the test directory. And this is intentional because integration tests, well, they're run in a different phase of Maven because they can require things like services to be running and databases to be up, and so then they they're more expensive to start up. They usually take a longer time to run. So where unit tests, you want each unit test to run on the order of milliseconds, it might take minutes to run all of your integration tests. So the integration tests for the student project and for the projects like 1, 2, and 3, they're still JUnit tests, but they interact with more than just classes. In particular, they interact with standard input and standard error really, and the and system.exit. So the whole idea is that this integration test exercises your main method. Now your main method is the thing that reads stuff from the command line and writes to standard output and standard error, and then has an exit code associated with it. And you won't be able to exercise all of that functionality within these integration tests, which are JUnit tests. So I wrote, a while back, I wrote a framework called invoke main test case, which allows you to run a main method in such a way that you can still have that main method do things like, quote unquote, exit the Java VM by calling system.exit, but it won't really exit. Instead, it will capture the fact that it exited, and it will let the test then validate the exit value. Similarly, it also lets you capture interactions between that the code under test, the main method, has with standard output and standard error, the system.out and the system.error. And so I'll walk you through this now. This is important to know so that you can use this testing tool to test your main method more easily. So you have unit tests that test like your student, or in your cases like your phone call and your phone bill and stuff. But then when it comes to interacting with system out and calling system.exit and stuff like that, you can use these integration tests. So the first test here, so this still uses JUnit. You can still use hamcrest and all that stuff. But in order to run it, instead of calling the code directly, you use methods like invoke main. So invoke main it takes a JavaLang class to represent the main class, and then some number of arguments. And both of these tests, the first one is, say, invoking a main method with no arguments has an exit code of 1. So when you invoke main, invoke main returns this object called a main method result. And this is the thing that has methods like get exit code, and it also has methods like get text written to standard error and standard out. And so then that lets you interrogate, the side effects that your main method has. Because remember, your main method, it returns void. So it's not like there's a lot of stuff you can communicate directly through just by invoking it. Instead, you have to rely on I/O, such as running a standard error, or having calling system.exit when you want things. So if we run this test, it passes right now because, well, let's go look at our main method and you'll find out. So when it's invoked with 0 arguments, it has a return code of 1. So let's go look at student.main. So it's our same student class, but now it's got a main method here someplace. Oh, there it is. Sure enough, what does it do? It prints something to standard error, and it calls an exit code of 1. So it doesn't matter how many command line arguments you send to it, it's going to have an exit code of 1. So when we go back to our student IT test, that's certainly the same. And then we have a similar test that says, well, when you invoke main with 0 arguments, it prints missing arguments to standard error. And so what we do is we invoke main again. We look at the text that was written to standard error and say that that should contain a string missing command line arguments, which it does. So yay! Much like the way we started this, let's have a test for like the ultimate goal of the main method. So invoke main with arguments from assignment. Actually, it's invoking main. Invoking main with arguments from assignment prints student toString. Student toString to standard output. Standard out. Super long name, but you know exactly what it does. So, we'll just copy. Well, actually, no, we'll start over again. Okay, so invoke main, and we're going to invoke student.class. And then our arguments, what are our arguments going to be? Let's go back to our assignment. So with these guys, and this is a bunch of strings, the string mail, the string this, algorithms, oops, need some commas in there. Java. So I'm going to put that into a variable. I'm going to call it result. It did a nice static import of that here. Actually, I'm going to do the same thing here. Add an import there. It makes it easier to read. So when I invoke it with all those command lines, or sorry, with those arguments, assert that result.get text written to standard out contains string this thing. And I want 2 spaces there. Okay. Right, so that's basically what we want our program to be able to do at the end. At the end of the day, we want to do that. So now we're going to run that. Insertion error. Expected this, but was empty. Because, right, nothing was written to standard out. So let's explore what it's like to implement the the main method. Now it's a little different because we've already got a lot of code that's written. So I don't know how much we want to do here. So let's go back to student main. And what we need to do, we need to take in all those command line arguments. And so now, I mean, really, what this thing needs to do is parse all of the command line arguments. So, oh, what can we do? Let's take a minute to do this the right way. So, let's look at all the arguments that it needs. It needs a string name. It needs a string. What are the arguments again? Gender. Oops. It needs a string GPA. Because remember, all this stuff is going to come in strings. We'll have to convert it to a double later. And then it has a bunch of classes. And then so it'll have a list of, list of string, which will be classes. Okay, well now we and then let's here's the pattern that I like to use. I like to say I like to iterate over all of the arguments. So for string arg in args, and then I just like to have something like the following. So I just say, hey, if name is null, null, then name equals arg. Else, if gender is null, then gender is the arg. Oops. Oh, what? Might not have been initialized. That is true. So I'll assign null to all those. Else, if GPA is null, then GPA equals args. Otherwise, well, this argument is a class. So classes.add arg. Oops. Now, I've been doing much more typing in the main method here than I was when I was doing TDD before. It's I don't know. I'm kind of in a little bit of a hurry, and I think I'm doing probably more than I should right here. But I'll go ahead and implement it, and you guys can figure out how to TDD it. But actually, I can still write some tests. So for instance, okay, well, so then I'll just leave it at this now, and then I'll go back to the student integration test. So, like for instance, we know that when there's no arguments, it prints that to standard error. But what about the following? So invoking main. Actually, forget that. Missing. What was the second argument? Gender. Yes, missing gender. Prints message to standard error. So now if I have my main method result, result, if I invoke main with the student class, with just the name but no gender, then I should assert that first of all the result dot get exit code is equal to 1 because it's an error. And I should also assert that result dot get text written to standard error contains string missing gender. So if I run that, expect it to fail. It still returned an exit code of 1. Well, that's nice, but instead I expected missing gender. Now it's missing command line arguments. So now I can go back and fix that in student. So I can say I only want. So here, if name equals null, I'll say missing command line arguments. Else, if gender equals null, then I'll have it say system.error.println. Printline. Missing gender. Yes, that was the name of the error message. And then system.exit1. Run this again. It's happy now. I see an opportunity to refactor. I'm going to call that a message. I'm going to say, going to call this, I'm going to create a method, which is, going to create a method, which is called print error message and exit. Try it again with the right stuff. Print error message and exit. Did it take one code fragment? Yes. Woohoo! Yay! Inline that. Run my test. That one passed. Let's run all the tests. Yay! All those passed too. So that's a pattern that you can follow to then test your command line parsing, right? Okay, so let's. I guess one other thing that we need to do is let's look at the other arguments. Okay, so gender. Remember, we don't have validation of gender implemented yet, but we do have validation of the GPA implemented. So let's do that. So let's have a test which is invalid GPA prints message to standard error. I do some copy and pasting here. Name. We don't actually do anything there, but the bad GPA will be that. So again, we want it to have the activity equal 1, and then say invalid. It's invalid GPA, bad GPA. Now we'll run that. We expected 1 but was null. Well, that's interesting. So yeah, that's a good point. I guess we don't. Yeah, in this case, we don't have anything there. So oops. So what do we want? We want. So now we want double. We'll call it GPA value. And okay, how do you convert a string into a double? You do the following. You say GPA value equals double dot parse double of GPA. What was it complaining about? It might be null. That's fine. Oh, well then. You know what? Thank you, Java compiler. That's very smart of you, because I did miss a thing here saying that if GPA equals null, print and exit error message missing GPA. Although I still don't think it, yeah. If I do this, though, is it smart enough? Oh, you know what I didn't do? No, I did that. Okay, never mind. Well, the compiler's not going to be smart enough to figure out that GPA will never be null here, because that returns. But that's okay. Actually, well, actually, now I want to test the GPA. I want to test the compiler. So if I say, well, all of these return here, will it then be smart enough to know that it always has a value? Oh, it is. Computers are so smart. Okay, so it has all this. So that's the GPA value. Now, well, let me show you what happens here if I try to run it. Because I gave it a bad double, and now it throws a number format exception. We don't want to just throw a number format exception. We want to have it print a nice error message. So I'm going to wrap this in a try catch for a number format exception, and then I'm going to say the following. I'm going to say that print error message and exit with, what did I want to say? It was invalid GPA, and then with the GPA. Try that. Nope, still didn't like it. What didn't it like? Oh, invalidate. Invalid. Run that again. What's more with feeling? And it passes. So this is how you can validate your command line numbers on your command line, stuff like that. Okay, well, there's probably more input validation that I could do, but really, I could do things. So I could have things like, oh, when I produce, or rather when I put in 0 classes on the command line, then I get a toString that contains the number 0. But I already have validation for that in my unit test. So I think really all I need to do now, I think I'm almost ready to get this last one to work. Because, what do I need to do? It's, get this last one here to work. It still doesn't print anything, but then all I need to do here is say, create my new student. So student equals new student with the name, the classes, the GPA, and the gender. And then I say system.out.println student, and that will invoke the toString method. Oh, what doesn't like about GPA value? Might not have been initialized. That is true. GPA value equals double dot nan. Yay! Why not? And let's give it now. Now let's give that a try. Yay! I just realized there's one more thing in the test though that I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that that the exit code is 0, because it is happy to. It is happy, and you should always have your code return 0. Have an exit code, because it's the 80s and we do stuff like that. So that exit 0. Yay! Okay, and that's it. And so I think that's pretty good. A comment on let me we're almost done. Actually, I'm getting a little hungry. I spent my entire morning doing this. And it's surprise, surprise. I can talk for 4 hours even when it's in the morning. So just to recap, what we've seen, right, what I've been showing you is integration testing. Well, actually, what I've been showing you is more testing. So first of all, you saw me do some more TDD with the unit testing. And then once I get to my unit tests to a point where I had the class working, then I turned my attention to the main method and how you test the main method. Well, now the main method isn't invoked like other methods are. So it's not like, oh, send it some well, yes, you do send it some input, but it's not exactly the same as testing a class. Instead, the way it interacts with its environment isn't through like returning a result or setting some state. Instead, what it does is it writes the standard out and it returns an exit code and all that kind of stuff, or it exits the VM with a certain exit code. And so then, in order to test, but you can still test this though using this invoke main test case that I provided with the student IT, and I think with there's a Project 1 IT with the phone bill, so I encourage you guys to use this too. So the tests are a little different here because what you're testing is the input and output through standard error and through the exit code, but you can still test it, and that's really important, right? Because I mean, there's logic here in the main method, right? And you need to test all of this logic. You need to test all of this, command line parsing and command line validation, and so you want to be able to test that. And you can do so in an integration test. And just one final thought. With regard to test-driven development, there is a school of thought that says, you could start doing TDD from the outside. You could do TDD solely on, you could just write your integration test and not have to write a student test. I don't know about that. I think once you know approximately what your classes are going to look like, write unit tests that focus on those classes. They'll run nice and fast. They'll give you they'll give you confidence that your class works. And if you ever want to reuse that class from a different context, so not have it driven by a command line program, have it driven by, I don't know, a web UI or a REST API, hint, hint, hint. You'll still have unit tests. You'll still have tests of that class, so you can be confident that that class still behaves as expected, even when it is used from different drivers. So anyway, I think I'm done. That's all. This was a lot of screencasts. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned a lot. I'm going to commit my code, and then I'm going to head off and enjoy the rest of my Sunday. And I hope you guys were able to enjoy your weekend and your Independence Day also. I will see you again in a couple of weeks. So, oh, actually, sorry, one more. Well, I guess I did change the main. Never mind. So let's just get out of here. So, implemented implemented the main method for student and tested it with student IT. And we're done.